Hello, it's Yellow and welcome back to my channel. Now guys, I will tell you about one of my weirdest nights at a hotel I was working in, so let's just jump right into the video. So this happened when I was working at the night shift at a hotel, and yes, it's the same hotel from a different video I did, and even though it's been a few years now, it's still one of the creepiest things I ever experienced. I've told the story to a few friends before, and every single time I tell it, I end up remembering little details that make it feel even stranger. Now, before I start, I want to clear about something. I'm not saying this was a ghost, I'm not saying this was anything paranormal, but I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe that was a completely normal explanation that we never figured out. But at the time, standing in those empty hallways at 3 in the morning, it definitely didn't feel normal. So when this happened, I was working the overnight shift at a hotel just outside of town, and it wasn't some giant luxury resort or anything like that. It was a pretty average three-story hotel located near the highway exit. We got a mix of business travelers, families on road trips, truck drivers, and people who just needed a place to sleep for the night. And I had been working there for about 6 months or 7 months. The night shift started at 10:30 p.m. and ended at like 7 a.m. So if you never worked overnight at a hotel, it's kind of honestly weird. During the day, the place feels safe, people are checking in, kids are running around the lobby, housekeeping is moving around everywhere, phones are ringing constantly. But after midnight, it's like an entire different building. Everything gets quiet, the hallways feel longer, every sound seems louder. And even simple things like an elevator opening can make you jump if you're not expecting it. And that night I was working with my coworker, we're gonna name Jake. And Jake was a good guy. He was in his mid 20s, way more experienced than me, and he'd been working overnight shifts for years. So nothing ever seemed to bother him. If a guest was drunk, Jake handled it. If somebody locked themselves out of their room, Jake handled it. If weird stuff happened, Jake usually had an explanation, and that's why his reaction later that night stuck with me. The shift started completely normal. Around midnight, we finished the last check-in, and by 1 in the morning, the lobby was fully empty. Jake was doing his routine security rounds while I sat behind the front desk watching cameras and trying not to fall asleep. In every hour, he would walk through all three floors, check emergency exits, make sure nobody was wandering around where they weren't supposed to be, and then he came back downstairs. And that was the same routine every night. And at around 2:30 a.m., the phone rang, and I answered. A man from room 218 sounded irritated, so he asked if we had maintenance workers on the second floor, and I answered him, no. He said someone had been walking outside his room for nearly an hour, back and forth, and at first I didn't think much of it. Honestly, hotels can be noisy. Maybe someone was on the phone, maybe someone couldn't sleep, but then he added something strange. He said he never heard a door open. He never heard a door close. Just footsteps, like constantly moving. I apologized to him and told him we'd check it out, like sorry for the inconvenience, we're coming there. And when Jake returned from his round, I told him about the complaint, and he shrugged and he said like probably some guy pacing, and that seemed reasonable. He headed upstairs. 5 minutes later, he came back and he said like no one's there. He explained that the hallways were completely empty, like no guests, no staff, nothing. So we figured the guests probably heard someone earlier and the sounds echoed longer than expected. Problem solved, right? Or so we thought. About 40 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same room, same guest, and this time he sounded frustrated. He told me the footsteps had started again almost immediately after Jake left, and I put him on hold and looked at Jake, and he sighed and he's like, alright, I'll check again. This time, about 5 minutes after he went upstairs, my radio crackled, and I hear, can you come to the second floor? And his voice sounded different, more serious. I grabbed my flashlight and headed straight upstairs. When I reached the second floor, Jake was standing near the middle of the hallway. He didn't say anything right away. He just raised a finger and he said like, "Yo, bro, listen." And I stood there and for a few seconds nothing. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, measured. Like somebody actually casually walking. And the sound was coming from like further down the hallway, near the corner leading to the emergency exit. The problem was that we could see the entire hallway, so nobody was there, and the footsteps continued for several seconds and then stopped completely. Jake looked at me and he said, like, you heard that, right? And I just nodded. Now, hearing footsteps in a hotel isn't weird. Hearing footsteps in an empty hallway while you're looking directly at that hallway, that felt weird. We walked toward like where the sound came from and the emergency exit door was closed. The alarm indicator showed it hadn't been opened and none of the nearby guest room door moved. There wasn't a single person in sight. We checked every hallway, every stairwell, every floor. Nothing. Eventually, we went back downstairs, and I remember trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe that, like, the sound traveled through the walls, maybe somebody was walking on a different floor, maybe acoustics were playing tricks on us. I don't know. But honestly, even then, I wasn't convinced. Like, around 3:30 a.m., things got even stranger. The hotel security system gave an alert. One of the hallway cameras on the third floor had detected motion. I pulled up the feed. The hallway looked completely empty, and a few seconds later, the alert triggered again. Then again, then again. Over and over. But the biggest problem was that the camera wasn't showing anybody, yet the motion detector kept activating. Jake leaned over my shoulder and he said, like, that's annoying. He grabbed his radio and headed upstairs. The second he stepped onto the third floor, the alerts stopped, like instantly. I watched him walk down the hallway on the monitor. Nothing unusual. A few minutes later, he returned to the lobby. The alerts started again. That was like when both of us started feeling uneasy. Not terrified, just uncomfortable. You know, the kind of feeling where your brain knows something isn't adding up. We reset the camera, the alerts continued. We checked for insects, loose objects, reflections, anything that might trigger motion detection. And then nothing. And then around 4:05 a.m., we heard it. A loud bang. Not a crash, just like bang. Not something dropping, like a bang. Like somebody had slammed into a wall. And the sound echoed through the building. Both of us jumped. Without even speaking, we grabbed flashlights and headed upstairs. The sound seemed to have come from the third floor. Then we arrived, everything was silent. The hallway was empty, no guests opening doors, no voices, nothing. And then Jake pointed. At the far end of the hallway sat a housekeeping cart. Like earlier in the night, we'd both seen it parked against the wall. Now, it had been moved several feet into the hallway. The wheels had locks on them, and I mean, at least they were supposed to. Jake walked over and inspected it. The wheels were still locked. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything. Because honestly, what do you even say in that situation? We unlocked the wheels, we pushed it back against the wall and locked the wheels again and continued checking the floor. And that's when we noticed another strange thing. One of the guest room doors near the end of the hallway was slightly open. Just barely, maybe an inch. And Jake knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. And eventually, a tired-looking businessman opened the door. He seemed confused. Jake asked if everything was alright, and the guest just nodded. Then he said something that made us both freeze. Oh, are you guys finally dealing with the footsteps? And Jake and I exchanged a look. The guest explained that he'd heard somebody walking up and down the hallway for a long time. He assumed it was security. But when he looked through the peephole multiple times, he never saw anyone. Just the sound, nothing else. At this point, two separate guests had reported the exact same thing. Neither of them knew each other. Neither had any reason to make it up. And that was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding. The rest of the shift was tense. Every noise made us look up. Every camera alert got our attention. But thankfully, nothing major happened after that. But neither of us felt like comfortable anymore. And when the sunrise finally started coming through the lobby windows, it honestly felt like relief. Guests started checking out, the morning staff arrived, everything seemed normal again. And a few days later, I mentioned the incident to one of the older employees. He'd been working there for nearly 7 or 8 years, and when I described the footsteps, he immediately knew what I was talking about. Apparently, multiple overnight employees had reported hearing the same thing over the years, and guests had complained about it too. Maintenance had investigated, management had investigated, nothing ever explained it. Like, I even searched online. The building wasn't old enough to have some dramatic haunted history. There weren't even like hidden hallways or anything, no secret access routes. And there was no obvious source for the footsteps, just unexplained footsteps, for years. Now, maybe there really is a logical explanation. Maybe sounds travel in like weird ways through the hotels. Maybe pipes, ventilation systems, or building materials create noise that sounds like footsteps. I honestly don't know, but I know what I heard that night. And Jake heard it too, and the two guests heard it as well. And none of us could find where it was coming from. I've worked plenty of overnight jobs since then, and I've heard strange noises before. Most of them ended up having like simple explanations, but this one never did. And even now, whenever I stay at a hotel and hear footsteps outside my room late at night, I find myself listening carefully, waiting to hear a door open, waiting like to hear a voice, waiting for some sign that there's actually a person out there. Because after that night, I learned something. Sometimes the creepiest thing isn't seeing somebody where they shouldn't be, it's hearing someone who isn't there at all. So guys, that's gonna be it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Go Dutch Grass if you haven't. And as always, stay yellow.